In our last video, I talked about the best tennis strings for beginners and intermediates, and I basically said that at that level, you shouldn't get too hung up on specifics. Just go for a full bed of multi, syngut, or in some cases a hybrid. My original goal with that video was to keep going and talk about all the other types of players wanting control, big spin, more feel, etc. But it would have been way too long, so I had to separate the two. That's what today's video is going to be about. We're going to get really nerdy talking about a bunch of different strings, mainly polyester strings that could work for different types of players, but also different types of situations you might find yourself in. If you've ever thought, well, I like this characteristic of my racket, but I wish it had a bit more of this or that, well, that's something that your string setup could solve. It's gonna be a fun video. I've been working on this one for a super long time, trying out a bunch of different poly setups and some pretty cool hybrids, so let's roll the intro. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I've promised more string content and here it is. Hopefully you guys like this one, and if you do, please support it with a like and subscribe if you haven't already. That lets me know you guys enjoy this type of content. I think I'm gonna title this video The Best Strings for Every Type of Player or something like that. And let me explain a little bit more specifically about what I mean by that. In that beginner and intermediate video, I said don't get too hung up on strings because you won't actually feel the small nuances in playability between each one. And if you do, it could end up distracting you from what's really important, developing your technique. Once you're an advanced player though, those small differences can actually be extremely important for fine-tuning your racket setup. I've been there myself. When I was switching to this Gravity Tour back in 2020, one of the issues I was having was not enough spin. I wanted a string with good feel because I've always prioritized that, but a lot of the strings that had good feel didn't necessarily help produce that much spin, or at least back then. That's when I realized going for a thinner string could be the perfect solution, because thinner strings naturally provide a bit more spin, and that ended up working out perfectly. That's just an example of X situation solved by a small tweak in your string setup, and we're gonna go over a bunch of different situations today with specific string setups to sort them out. That's going to be the main focus of this video. We are also going to talk about the flip side of that, strings that complement a frame's standout characteristic. Then we'll spend a bit of time talking about different types of strings that can work for specific game styles. Now, I will admit the string is less important than the racket in this case, but it still does play a part. We'll go over counterpunchers, baseliners, attacking players, and a few others, like we did in that video about the best rackets for every type of player. Actually, speaking of that video, I think I'm finally going to update it. It's probably worth it at this point, so stay tuned for that one. We're going to get into it now. This is probably going to be another super long video, and of course remember that any of the strings we talk about here today you can come string up in your racket if you visit us in store, and some of the reels you can also buy on our website racketsandrunners.ca. One of the best things that strings allow you to do is customize the playability of your racket beyond the limitations of the frame itself. Basically, you can use the strings to kind of eliminate certain weaknesses within the frame. Whether it's power rackets, spin rackets, or control rackets, each frame has some area where it's not the best, and we're going to start with control rackets. This is about as true of a control racket as you'll find. It has a thin beam, a super soft flex, a really dense 18x20 string pattern, and all those things are great for optimizing control. The problem is that by cranking control up so high, the frame lacks other things, mainly power and spin. That's where your strings can come in. Now, this hasn't been scientifically proven, but strings make up anywhere from 50 to 70% of your racket's playability on contact. And that shouldn't be too surprising. Strings are what's actually making contact with the ball after all. So if you want to play with this racket because you like its control profile, you're used to its flex, its swing path, its feel, but then you're also like, well, it's 2025, I need more power and spin, you can adapt the strings accordingly. I put Solinco Hyper G in a 17 gauge in this racket because it still allows the racket's control to shine through, but this string adds significantly more spin, and also the thinner gauge is naturally a bit more powerful. I've chosen Hyper G specifically because there are other spin-friendly strings, but sharp strings like this generate spin in a slightly different way to really slick strings like RPM Blast, or rough strings like RPM Rough. The way sharp strings generate spin is that they add a slightly higher launch angle when you swing from low to high. Basically, that shape gives you a bit more purchase over the ball, so you can almost grab onto it and make it dip. In a super low launching racket like this, that's exactly what I'm looking for to add a bit more variety to my shot selection. When I want to hit flat, it's still super consistent, but then it's more spin friendly when I'm looking to add spin for margin. So if you have a control racket like this and you're looking for a bit more spin and power, go for a sharp string and keep it on the thinner side. Hyper-G is great, but you've also got Lynx Tour, which is one of my favorite strings, and a number of other options. Now, if a thin gauge alone isn't enough for the increase in power that you're hoping for, there's a new type of string that's becoming very popular recently, the soft shape string. Softer strings are more elastic, so they generate more power. Up until recently, most soft polys had been round, so not necessarily the most spin friendly, but now we've got some great soft shaped polys. Strings like Toro Lino Toro, Caviar, and Wasabi are great. Solinco Mach 10 is another one that's become super popular recently because of the amount of power and spin it generates. The one little qualm I have with these strings is their feel. They can feel a little plasticky and muted, and when I am playing with control rackets, I like feel to be as good as possible, but that's more of a personal preference thing. For most people, they should be a great option for increasing power and spin in control rackets, but while we're on the topic of feel, let's move on to the next type of string, strings that actually help improve a racket's feel. You all know how I feel about feel. I love good feel, and it's to the point where sometimes bad feel is enough to turn me away from a racket completely. That's a bit of a bummer because there are some rackets that may not feel the best but have some other great characteristics, and I've recently discovered that sometimes you just need to be a little bit smarter about your string choice, and that can correct those issues. Yonex rackets. I've been pretty vocal about the slightly mushy feel we have on current Yonex rackets, except for the Percept. But I also have to admit that I haven't always been very intelligent about the strings I put in their rackets when I'm testing them. I've always kind of defaulted to Yonex Polytour Pro and Yonex rackets because I used to like that string a lot, and I did think it worked really well in older Yonex rackets. But nowadays, a mushy racket plus mushy string is a recipe for disaster in terms of feel. I decided to put Solinco Hyper-G round into this E-Zone 98, and I have to say, it feels so much better. It's still not the purest hitting experience of all time, but this string makes this racket feel a lot more crisp. Hyper-G has a magical sort of pop to it. We've known that with the sharp version of the string for years. The same is true for the round one, just with a little bit less grip, and it's really transformed my experience with this racket. I like pretty much everything else about this E-Zone in terms of spin, power, even control and launch angle. So a fairly stiff round string like this allows me to keep those things constant, so the only thing that really changes is the feel, exactly what I wanted. So in rackets that are maybe a little bit muted, mushy, like this E-Zone, like the current version of the Blade, the CX line, even some rackets with Auxetic 2.0, try polyesters that have really good feel. Strings like Luxilon Alu Power, Hyper-G, Lynx Tour, Babolat RPM Rough, those are some of my favorite polys in terms of feel, and between the four of those, you can pick them based off of the other characteristics they have. Alu Power and Hyper-G Round are the most well-rounded and non-intrusive on other characteristics, like I was just saying. Normal Hyper-G and Lynx Tour add a bit more grip and launch while still providing incredible feel. And RPM Rough, I'll talk about more later, but it's got some insane snapback. You also can, of course, use natural gut to improve a racket's feel, but I actually think it's best to avoid it in this case. Natural gut definitely provides the best feel of any string, and that's a huge part of the reason you buy it, but it's also extremely expensive, and when you put it in a racket that doesn't have the best feel to begin with, it's almost like putting premium gas in a basic car. It's kind of a waste. No matter what, you're never going to get the best feel out of it, so I would save your money unless, of course, you want to use gut for its other characteristics. That actually brings me nicely to my next topic of discussion, the best strings for those of you looking for more comfort out of your racket setup. Uncomfortable rackets tend to be more power-oriented rackets because they're stiffer, rackets like the Pure Drive, the Pure Arrows, and the V-Cores. Now, a lot of players put stiffer polys into these rackets because stiffer strings are more controlled, and you may want a little bit more control out of your power racket, but stiff poly plus stiff racket can be a bit much for some people. The good news is there are some very good soft polys, and you're still using a poly at that point, so you're not making a huge sacrifice in control for better comfort. Strings like Yonex Polytour Pro, Toro Line Caviar and Wasabi, Luxilon Element, those are great soft polys that are going to be much more comfortable than stiff polys, but still controlled enough. You can see here in this Babolat Pure Drive, which is a notoriously stiff, uncomfortable racket, I've put Toro Line Caviar into it, which softens up the feel, and it also opens up the sweet spot a bit to make it feel less harsh. Now, of course, you don't have to stick with polyester strings if you want more comfort. If you want something even softer, that's where natural gut is hands down the best option. When you hybrid natural gut in the mains and a round or rough poly in the crotch, crosses, you've just significantly improved your racket's comfort to the point where I can almost guarantee you won't have any issues going forward. You can even string the gut a little higher than you're used to if you're worried about control, and I promise you higher tension won't make it that much less comfortable. Now, if you are going to try gut for comfort, stick with a hybrid. One, it's cheaper, and two, you still need that poly for control and spin in modern tennis. Personally, I always recommend a rough string and a hybrid setup with gut. The rough texture glides a lot better on the gut, which helps with snapback. The elephant in the room here is that gut obviously isn't going to be for everyone. It's very expensive, so you can substitute the gut with a multi-filament. You'll get most of the comfort benefits. Now, fair warning, no multi is anywhere near as good as natural gut at most other things. And nowadays, there's actually some pretty good poly-poly hybrids you could try. These have become really popular recently, and with good reason. You get certain benefits from one poly and other benefits from the other. Look at Casper Ruud. He plays with a very spin-friendly racket and then puts a super spin-friendly shaped string in the mains, but for whatever reason, whether it's to add more power or more comfort, he puts a soft round poly in the crosses. That's a really good option and something I've been using in the previous E-Zone here. I've got Lynx Tour in the mains, Poly Tour Pro in the crosses. A full bed of Poly Tour Pro, I've already said, and this racket is way too mushy. A full bed of Lynx Tour I did like, but I was having slight discomfort issues. This is a pretty stiff frame. I decided to try the hybrid, keep that nice spin and control from Lynx Tour in the mains, but soften it up with Poly Tour Pro, and this is magical. No more comfort issues, still plenty of spin, and even the feel is still good because Lynx Tour is so crisp. I'll definitely be exploring with these poly-poly hybrids a little more, but that's kind of the idea here, is the poly in the cross is a substitute for a multi-filament, so it's generally going to be a softer, rounder string like Poly Tour Pro or Luxilon Element. Now, to finish up this section, I want to talk about spin rackets. The main issue with spin rackets is that to become so spin-friendly, they need really open string beds and a lot of string movement, which can make them a little bit wild and uncontrollable. Rackets like the Extreme MP come to mind, the Aero 100 to a certain extent as well, although it has gotten a little bit more controlled recently. But if you do want to add more control to these spin rackets, these are some good stringing options. The best thing to do is to go for a thicker gauge round string. A thicker string closes up that string bed a little bit, and it also helps with durability, which can be a real issue. Spin rackets do tend to eat strings up. I also say keep it round because, like I mentioned earlier, sharp strings add a bit of launch angle, and in spin rackets where that launch angle is already a little bit inconsistent, sharp strings can make that even worse. Round strings just kind of tone things down a little bit, and if you want to still keep it super spin friendly, go for a round rough string. That's actually a great place to wrap up this section and move on to the next one, where instead of talking about strings that make up for a frame's weaknesses, we're going to talk about string and racket complementarity. Now, a lot of people who buy a spin racket, a power racket, a control racket, buy it because they want a ton of spin, power, and control, and they don't necessarily care about anything else. So with their strings, they actually want to increase those characteristics. This is string and racket complementarity. This section is going to be for those players who are looking for strings that enhance a frame's standout characteristic, and we're going to start with spin rackets because I think they're the most straightforward. Most people know that polyester strings are very spin friendly, and within the category of polys, there are some that are more spin friendly than others. There are two types of very spinny polys: shaped polys and rough polys, and I actually think that rough polys are a better option in spin rackets. We've talked about how shaped polys increase the grip you have on the ball by slightly increasing launch angle, and how in spin rackets that already have quite a high launch angle, they can be a little bit inconsistent. Rough strings are round, so they don't really add launch angle or make it feel like the racket is gripping onto the ball even more. The way they add spin is by increasing snapback. The string snapping in and out of position is a huge part of how much spin you generate, so more snapback means more spin. The fact that rough strings increase spin at little to no expense of control and consistency is why I consider them a slightly better option to shape strings in spin rackets. RPM Rough is one of the snappiest strings I've ever tested. You can almost feel that increase in snapback, it's so intense, and because of that, this is one of the most spin-friendly polys out there. I don't have RPM Rough in any true spin racket right now, but I've had great success with it in both the Aero 98 and the Aero 100. RPM Blast is also a great option. It's not rough and it is technically shaped, but it also has a ton of snapback, although noticeably less than RPM Rough. Now let's move on to really controlled strings and control-oriented rackets. Earlier I mentioned Hyper G in an 1820, and Hyper G is an excellent control string, But like any sharp string, it can be a little bit inconsistent. A lot of the people who go for control rackets do so because they want to neutralize the effect of the racket on the ball so that they're in complete control, and sharp strings, because they add a little bit of launch angle, don't make for a totally neutral feel. This is when you want to go for a round, stiff poly. The round shape makes the string bed completely consistent, and the stiffer feel means you won't get any extra power or mushiness from the string itself. Stiff strings allow the flex of the racket to be the main character in terms of feel, and usually control-oriented rackets have a very consistent flex and feel, which adds to their sensation of control. This TI Radical is a great example of that. I have Luxilon 4G in here, which is a pretty stiff round poly, and that allows me to feel the flex of the racket to control the ball without the strings adding too much of anything. Now you might hear stiff polyester strings and think, isn't that going to be uncomfortable? Well, the good news is that usually control-oriented rackets are quite soft, so they are comfortable enough where you can use a stiff string without any issues. But yeah, the whole idea here with control rackets and controlled strings is neutralization. Frame neutralization and string bed neutralization. At the end of the day, that's what gives you, the player, the most control possible. So if that's what you're looking for, this is your setup. Some great stiff round polys are Luxilon 4G, like I just mentioned, Alu Power, Head Hawk Touch, and Hyper G Round. That's honestly becoming one of my favorite strings these days. Now, powerful strings and powerful rackets. You can obviously go for something softer like a multi-filament or a natural gut, although again, I highly recommend you hybrid them with a polyester to keep some form of spin and control. You can also, again, go for softer polyesters, Polytour Pro, Luxilon Element, Toroline Caviar, and I think we're bringing some other soft polys into the store very soon. The other option here is low tension. If you want to create a super powerful setup, you get a stiff, powerful racket with tension in the mid to low 40s, and bam, you've got yourself a rocket launcher. Low tension is also quite spin friendly because there's a lot of string snapback, so that gives you a good margin shot. And also, low tension is more comfortable than high tension. Remember, these stiff rackets are less comfortable, so trying to make that setup more comfortable is never a bad thing, even if you have no comfort issues. You never know when those are gonna start. If you do want to try lower tension in a powerful racket, you can really go with any poly. Just go with one that makes the most sense for the other characteristics that you want out of it. So far this video has been mainly about matching the string to the racket based off of your preferences as a player. It hasn't really been baseliners get this, attacking players get that, and that's because the strings are less important than your racket in that sense, but there still are certain strings that fit specific game styles very well. That's what we're gonna do now, and some of what I say here may overlap a bit with what I've already said, but anyways, let's get into aggressive baseliners. Aggressive baseliners need two things: the ability to grind and stay confident in a rally while it develops, and then a little bit more power and control to complement their shot when they really go for it. Solinco Mach 10, Babolat RPM Rough, and Toroline Toro are perfect for this style since they combine a ton of spin with a little bit more power. And because they're so spin friendly, they'll naturally help you control that big swing, especially if you're hitting with modern technique. Aggressive baseliners should also really consider poly-poly hybrids with stiffer, more spin friendly strings in the mains, and then softer strings in the crosses. Again, this gives a really good blend of spin and control, but with power that a full bed of stiff string can't match, and there are so many different combinations you can do here. I think Polytour Pro is one of the best cross strings for this type of setup because it's so much softer than average for a poly, but you can also go for soft shape strings. Toroline is kind of the king of those right now, with Caviar and Wasabi as great cross string options, and Otoro is a little bit stiffer, so it's a perfect one to throw in the mains. Now let's move on to counterpunchers, and for counterpunchers, you can pretty much copy what I said in that section where I talked about control-oriented strings and control-oriented rackets. Counterpunchers play a slower style where they basically never want to miss, so optimizing control is the most important thing, and that's where a stiff, round, neutral poly is perfect. Again, Luxilon 4G, Head Hawk Touch, and of course, good old Alu Power. There's a reason those strings were so popular on the Pro Tour during the 2000s and 2010s when so many players were counterpunching with controlled 1820s. These have lost a bit of popularity over the years as more flashy, spin-friendly, and powerful polys have come out, but they are still the meat and potatoes of what makes a good, classic, neutral polyester string. Then you've got all court players. You guys should look at strings that are very well-rounded, ironically, not necessarily round strings, strings that give you good access to spin from the baseline, control when you need it, and then good feel up at the net. Solinco Hyper G, Luxilon Alu Power, and Head Lynx Tour are kind of my three favorite do-it-all strings, Alu Power if you want the most consistent feel, Hyper G if you want the most spin, and then Lynx Tour somewhere in between the two. Now the last thing we need to talk about with strings is durability. A lot of you prioritize durability from your string bed, either because you break strings really often or because you just don't want to be restringing your racket all the time. There are two things you should consider here: tension maintenance, and then just generally how long the strings take to break. In terms of tension maintenance, the best poly is and probably always will be Luxilon 4G. It's pretty crazy how well this string holds tension. Solinco Confidential is also really good, and Toraline strings as well. Toraline strings are quite soft though, so they break a lot quicker than 4G and Confidential, so you have to keep that in mind if you want durability in both senses. 4G and Confidential are the best that combine the two. I also want to mention some strings that aren't very durable. Babolat RPM Blast and Luxilon Alu Power, two of the most popular strings in the world. Neither has great tension maintenance, they both notch pretty quickly, and Alu Power drops off a cliff in terms of playability very fast. When it's on, it's probably the best polyester ever, but once it drops off that cliff, it is borderline unplayable. The point is, just because those strings are so popular doesn't mean they're the best at everything, but they are still really, really good strings when they are at their best. But yeah, that's about it for strings. We talked about a lot of stuff today. A lot of testing went into this one. I know it was a long video, but hopefully you enjoyed it. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the comment section. I will do my best to answer as many of them as I can. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to string your racket with any of the strings we talked about here today, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.